I think the largest economic risk that we're engaging in right now is what folks are calling the polycrisis. That there is no longer one particular risk, is that we now have to be dealing with a set of compound risks. We have a high interest rate environment, and when that happens, that sends shockwaves, especially into the global south. But then there could be a war or a conflict in the Middle East or Russia. Then there could be sanctions on that. That could affect trade patterns. Then another country might put in tariffs and protectionism that could have another impact. And so the multitude and compounding of crises, right? Then throw a pandemic on that and a hurricane that wipes out a bunch of small island states. Countries now have to have a toolkit and a international financial architect that helps prevent and mitigate these things. We're in a globally interconnected world. We've emitted so much carbon that these climate shocks are going to happen, and we're so interconnected. When there's a skirmish in one place, it's going to have an impact in another, and that's the world we've built, and it's only going to become more integrated on that level. And so we need to build a system that allows us to be resilient, to allows us to be able to prevent and mitigate these kind of things. And so I'm not worried about any one thing. What I'm worried about is that we're in a more uncertain world. Right? Uncertainty is also an opportunity. We live in a much more innovative capacity world. We're building new ways of doing policy, new ways of doing technology, new ways of organizing human behavior. It's a wonderful world to be in many ways. But we need to channel that innovation into ways of providing resilience. Is that we need to be able to grow and prosper collectively while being able to make sure that we can prevent and mitigate the unpredictable onslaught of negative shocks that seem to occur every single morning when you wake up and read the newspaper. My name is Kevin Gallagher. I'm a professor at Boston University, and I direct Boston University's Global Development Policy Center, or the GDP Center as we like to call ourselves. This century hasn't been so great for the global economy. And in the aftermath of the global financial crisis, 2008, 2009, it just became abundantly clear that a long-term trend of the decline of the sort of institutional makeup, or what people call the international financial architecture, that it really wasn't fit for purpose. The world almost blew up in 2008 and 2009, and the reverberations after that have really been grave. We're living in a world that is highly unequal. We're living in a world where there's a climate crisis, and we're living in a world that it's just not resilient to be able to capture or react to who knows what is going to hit us every single day, whether it be a massive interest rate hike or a pandemic or a war and sanctions. All of these things are having huge ripples across the world, and our system is not there to be able to equip it. And history seems to be coming back. The last time we built a system like this, it was in the midst of recession and depression, war, polarization, and a lack of global leadership. And the U.S. took leadership on that in 1944 and built this system, but it really started to collapse around the 1980s, and the nail in the coffin might have been early January 2025. There's really three basic problems with the international financial architecture. Number one, it's not big enough. We don't have a big enough pool of finance to, A, provide long-run development finance so we can build new economies that are more equal, lower carbon, and more resilient. And then we also don't have enough finance to be able to prevent and mitigate the kinds of shocks that are inevitably going to happen. Interest rate shocks, financial shocks, climate shocks, these things are going to happen, and we just don't have the firepower to be able to react and prevent and mitigate those things. So number one, the system isn't big enough. Number two, system isn't good enough. It's not delivering, even with the small amounts of money that it has for the 20th century kind of problems. It is not doing a great job at providing finance to be able to transform our economies to be more socially inclusive and more low carbon. It's not doing a good job of being able to prevent and mitigate financial crises. So number two, they're not good enough. And number three, they're not inclusive enough. That they were set up after World War II to basically be run by countries in the global north. The IMF and the World Bank, there's a gentleman's agreement that the head of the IMF is always someone from Europe, and the head of the World Bank is always an American citizen, and that in both institutions, the United States has veto power over all major institutions. That might have been the way to look at the world in 1944. And as long as those major powers, these hegemons as we might call them, were enlightened, and you could make a case that in the post-war era, the United States didn't want to see imperialism. They didn't want more war. They certainly didn't want more depression, because we saw when it gets globalized, the folks like Hitler come up and make things much worse off. And they said it might be better to be the hegemon of the world, to try to also foster the ability for everyone to be better off, because it's better for everyone to be better off than not to be so good off and to be fighting with each other. That is the way that the whole thing was set up. And in the 21st century, the United States is a small part of the global economy. And it hasn't been acting for decades now as that sort of enlightened leader. We have all sorts of countries, Brazil, South Africa, China, of course, that these countries have so little say in how these institutions work. And so the third thing is that these institutions are not inclusive. They don't represent the voice and the stature of a multipolar, 7+ billion person world. And not just the other countries, but the people in those countries. Sometimes certain countries aren't represented by the full populace in those countries, but those countries will agree to a certain project that might not be so beneficial for the communities around it, and they perhaps have the least say in these institutions, and that's just not fit for purpose in the 21st century. At the GDP Center in 2019, 2018, we put together a series of global roundtables with the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development. And we brought together civil society organizations, current officials, ex-officials from the North and the South to have a series of roundtables saying, this system is broken. But rather than diving into the economics and the institutional details, we'll say, let's just take a step back, because the system in the 1940s was created on a basic set of principles. And so before we reform something, that we need to build it back better, like what kind of principles should it be founded on? And the principles in 1944 were, one, let's try to combine peace and prosperity, that without prosperity, you're probably not going to have peace. And so therefore we need to advance global prosperity. If everyone is better off from a prosperous perspective, we're not going to have depressions and we're not going to have war. And then the second key principle was we want to leave countries enough national autonomy to be able to pursue full employment, right? That's what everyone's thinking after the financial crisis in the 1930s. Is all these 1 in 4 Americans was unemployed. It's like countries need to be able to they want to promote stability, financial stability, and full employment. The world's a little bit more complex now. And so with this series of roundtables, we came up with five principles that I share in a book with Richard Kozel-Wright called The Case for the New Bretton Woods. So principle number one is that the system has to be geared towards a mission, right? Markets and states aren't just ends, they're means to an end. And as I said, the ends before were full employment and stability. This time, full employment, financial stability, those are really important, but also being able to create a more equal and more lower carbon and more a resilient global economy. That's number one. Number two is that we need common but differentiated responsibilities, or special and differentiated treatment. What does that mean? That comes out of legal language, but it basically means, say, for something like climate change, that a country like Haiti should not have the same global responsibilities to deal with climate change as, say, the United States and China, right? The United States and China are the two largest historical and current emitters and the two largest economies in the world. They should take bigger responsibility of dealing with creating a low-carbon world than, say, Haiti does. That's what that sort of means. Number three is that countries need the policy space to be able to pursue their national development strategies. The way Haiti wants to develop its economy is going to be very different than South Africa, right? Larger, not an island, et cetera. And so countries need the space to be able to develop the kinds of policies they've had. And the international financial architecture really crept in to your kitchen table and prescribed different ways that you're supposed to run your economy. And that a new set of principles is that countries should have the autonomy to design their own national development strategies, and they're not going to be one size fits all. It's going to be very different depending upon what kind of country that you live in, what kind of population, what kind of endowments you have. The fourth thing, which is perhaps one of the most important, is that no pursuit of one country's national development strategy should have a negative impact on another country's development strategy. Therefore, over-subsidization or over-protectionism, if that's going to hurt another country, then that isn't going to rise all the boats in the world, and there needs to be rules to deal with that. That's our fourth one, and then the fifth one is that there needs to be a principle of being able to hold each other accountable to all this. That we need to have checks and balances so that one country doesn't overtake the system, or these principles such as if you see one country saying having a set of development strategies that hurts another ones, that there needs to be some sort of a built-in check and balance to be able to create that balance in the system. So those are sort of the five principles from which to build on a reforming of the architecture. One of the great things that they realized in 1944 is that we needed what was called longer run counter-cyclical finance. What does that mean? Well, private markets are great, they're important, we need private markets in the global marketplace, but they're very volatile. When things are really good, people will invest. When things don't look so good, they retreat to go find somewhere else to invest. And if you're looking for long-run sustained development, you need certain kinds of finance that's going to counter that retreat that the private sector has. That was what created the World Bank in 1944. And so now, to create a low-carbon, socially inclusive, and resilient global economy, we need a stepwise increase in the mobilization of finance across the world, especially in the global south. Most estimates say that by 2030, we're going to need about $3 trillion annually. That equates to about 3.5% of GDP more than countries are investing now, to invest in transitioning your economy from from a high carbon to a lower carbon economy, to make it more resilient, to have policies that are more universal for education for women, to narrow the inequality gaps. That's a huge resource mobilization component. The private sector is not going to do that on its own, and the public sector needs to be there, especially for the longer run view and to move the private sector into this. And so one of the things that we really need to do is to reform what are called the multilateral development banks. So in 1944 at Bretton Woods, they just created the World Bank. Now there's actually over 300 development finance institutions around the world with a collective balance sheet of $23 trillion. So how do we galvanize that money to agree on a common set of goals underneath these principles to be able to steer finance there? But we also need to regulate the private sector. The private sector does what you want when things are going well, but they tend to retreat to safer markets when things aren't going so well. And so one of the core principles of the 1944 agreements were that countries should be able to regulate capital so that it's being steered into the sectors that you want to get the social goals met in, and to maintain the financial stability. Beginning in the 1970s, but really accentuating in the 80s and 90s, a lot of the regulations to manage and regulate capital have been pulled away in the global north and in the global south. That's what led to the global financial crisis in 2008, and that's what makes countries so susceptible to these crises now. So to solve the climate crisis and the development crisis, these things can be done at the same time. Because what we need is massive investment to be able to change the structure of our economies to become more socially resilient, to more low carbon. And that's a growth path. That's a national development strategy. It'll be different for different countries. A country, I mentioned Haiti earlier, a country like Haiti doesn't have coal plants, it doesn't have lots of gas-guzzling cars, but its strategy needs to be more on the resilient and equality end, right? They get hit by floods and sea level rise and things like that, whereas a country like South Africa or the United States, they have a big capital stock, which is very carbon intensive and very unequal. And we have to work more on replacing the existing capital stock with something that's cleaner and more inclusive. So it's going to mean different things for different people, but this $3 trillion annually is an investment opportunity. What's fascinating is that the financial sector is now upwards of around $500 trillion. That's the sort of sum of all the assets and liabilities in the world. And that's grown by a factor of 10 since 1980. What's interesting since 1980 is that the amount of investment into productive capital since 1980 has not changed. It's all basically, with the exception of China, it's only been about 20% of GDP in rich and poorer countries. And so one of the core missions, or the policy that manifests this, the mission that we have to have, is a real mobilization of finance. And it's going to take three things. One is incentives. We need to have rules that say this is a good thing to invest in, that's not such a great thing to invest in, to send markets and these development banks in the right direction. Number two, we need the actual investment. We need to mobilize this kind of capital. And number three, we need lots of innovation. A lot of the solutions have not been invented yet. That's not a problem, that's an opportunity. And we need to invest a lot in innovation to be able to have new forms of technology, new policy mixes, and new ways for people to figure out ways to prosper in a changing global environment. John Maynard Keynes, who was one of the architects of 1944, said we better put this stuff together to save capitalism from itself, and we're really at that moment now. Capitalism has become so unbridled. There's really a shift that started in the 1980s where markets are beautiful, right? With the right incentives, they can really help us achieve social goals. But what started to happen in the 1980s is that we moved from markets as a means to an end to marketization and financialization and free markets as an end in and of themselves. And we've seen what that happened, especially the liberalization of financial markets. There's no economic theory that says if you liberalize finance that it's going to cause economic growth and cause equality and help us move away from a climate crisis. That's pretty far from what any theorist has ever thought, and unfortunately, because there's no theory on it, that's why the liberalization of financial markets has made the world so unstable, has allocated finance towards a very highly carbon-intensive kind of economic activity, and it's just increased and made inequality so persistent. And so we have to use these principles to say, hey, capitalism can be a great thing. It can be a great way that, like I was talking about innovation, it's like, planners can't figure out how all this stuff is going to work, right? And the state is never going to have enough money and enough capacity to be able to do all this stuff. But we need to make capitalism work for social goals rather than being an end in itself. And so, one, we need public banks and public financing to point in the right direction. And two, we need incentives and regulations to help steer all that capital towards these social ends. I think the largest economic risk that we're engaging in right now is what folks are calling the polycrisis. That there is no longer one particular risk, is that we now have to be dealing with a set of compound risks. We have a high interest rate environment, and when that happens, that sends shockwaves, especially into the global south. But then there could be a war or a conflict in the Middle East or Russia. Then there could be sanctions on that. That could affect trade patterns. Then another country might put in tariffs and protectionism that could have another impact. And so the multitude and compounding of crises, right? Then throw a pandemic on that and a hurricane that wipes out a bunch of small island states. Countries now have to have a toolkit and an international financial architect that helps prevent and mitigate these things. We're in a globally interconnected world. We've emitted so much carbon that these climate shocks are going to happen, and we're so interconnected. When there's a skirmish in one place, it's going to have an impact in another, and that's the world we've built, and it's only going to become more integrated on that level. And so we need to build a system that allows us to be resilient, to allows us to be able to prevent and mitigate these kind of things. And so I'm not worried about any one thing. What I'm worried about is that we're in a more uncertain world. Right? Uncertainty is also an opportunity. We live in a much more innovative capacity world. We're building new ways of doing policy, new ways of doing technology, new ways of organizing human behavior. It's a wonderful world to be in many ways. But we need to channel that innovation into ways of providing resilience. Is that we need to be able to grow and prosper collectively while being able to make sure that we can prevent and mitigate the unpredictable onslaught of negative shocks that seem to occur every single morning when you wake up and read the newspaper.